Dr. Davis, the question right now in everybody's mind is that as tensions grow between the US and NATO allies over Russia-Ukraine peace talks, a latest report by former Pentagon officer has said that Trump may be planning to exit NATO. Your assessment, do you think that this is perhaps a realistic threat?
I think it is a realistic threat. I think that Trump is determined to accommodate Putin's wishes at every opportunity without demanding anything in return from Putin. So I think that when you look back at the period immediately prior to the last invasion by Russia of Ukraine, the period of November 2021, Putin laid down a series of demands to the West, and these included the withdrawal of NATO from Eastern and Central Europe, the removal of any prospect for Ukraine joining NATO, and the removal of any security guarantees to Ukraine and the demilitarization of Ukraine. Every single one of those is now on the negotiating table. And given the way that Trump seems to be approaching this in what can only be described as a process of utter capitulation, I think it is quite possible that Putin will demand that certainly US forces and NATO forces withdraw from Central and Eastern Europe. And Trump may be incentivized then to simply withdraw from NATO altogether.
Right, Dr. Davis, I do want to talk about the ramifications of exiting NATO, that is, if US does exit NATO. But first up, like you also mentioned, the European nations and Kiev have clearly been sidelined over Ukraine peace talks. However, European officials have warned that a Ukraine peace deal without their participation will not work. So do you think that this threat of exiting NATO is a way by which Europe may not add any roadblocks in US-Russia peace talks?
Well, I think the Europeans are quite correct to say that it won't work. And I think that it's not intended to work, at least not from Putin's perspective. Putin sees a ceasefire as merely an opportunity for a pause, to regroup and rearm in order to either launch the war against Ukraine in a year or so to take more territory, or potentially to attack NATO directly. It's quite interesting that Russia is planning to deploy 150,000 troops into Belarus close to the Polish border in July. And I think that if you then see US forces withdraw from the Baltic states and from other potential states in Central and Eastern Europe, that would leave NATO highly exposed. So really what we're talking about here is not a ceasefire leading to peace. We're talking about a pause in the conflict leading to peace in our time. And we all know where that led in 1938. So I do think that we need to be very cautious about seeing anything positive in this situation. This situation is akin to a surrender by the United States to Putin's demands and sowing the seeds for the next war, which will be much more dangerous, much wider in geographical scope, with all the potential for escalation through the nuclear threshold.
Right, you did touch upon the ramifications if US exits NATO. My last question to you, do you think Europe is more worried about themselves than Ukraine altogether?
No, I think that Europe is worried about both. They're worried about their own security, and I think they are right to be, because Russia now poses a real threat to their security, a threat of imminent attack. And they're also worried about Ukraine because they understand that if Russia wins in Ukraine because we essentially cede Ukraine to them as Putin demands, then it just reinforces the prospect of that wider war. So if you do have the US withdraw from NATO, that achieves one of Putin's big aims. It incentivizes him to push for more and grab more territory. And if you then have basically submission and capitulation in Ukraine, it guarantees almost that Russia will make a move against NATO within the next year or two. So I do think the Europeans are very right to be very concerned about their own security at this point.
Right. Thanks very much, Dr. Davis, for joining us on WION and sharing your insights with us on this story.
Thank you.